Welcome to all of you to another interview in the context of transformations of the popular. My name is Theresa Specht and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the project BO4, which is concerned with the Middle Ages in popular fantasy fiction. With me here today is Professor Carolyne Larrington from St. John's College at Oxford University. She has been for several weeks now our research fellow guest in a cooperative research group which was concerned with the popularizations of the past in nowadays popular culture. Welcome, Carolyne. It is a great pleasure to have you here and to have the opportunity to do this interview with you.
It's wonderful to be here.
Thank you. Carolyne, you are a professor for medieval European literature and you're specialized in Old Norse and Old Icelandic literature, and as well as in Arthurian literature. But yet you are very interested in popular fantasy fiction. Tell me, how did that happen?
I've always been interested particularly in how Old Norse myth and legend has been received in the medieval period. But that's not necessarily fantasy. And what really interested me in fantasy in the first place was watching the show Game of Thrones on a plane on my way to America in 2012. I'd heard about the show already and I knew that season 2 was being filmed in Iceland. So I thought I should be interested in this. But it was only when I got the opportunity to start watching on the plane that I thought, wow, this is really interesting.
Okay, so you just bumped into it in some way by coincidence, or when you had the opportunity to finally have the time to watch it, because it takes you, what, I think nearly 80 hours to do
70 hours.
70 hours?
70 hours, yeah. Yes.
I've forgotten already. So what was it, apart from the being filmed in Iceland and the surrounding, that caught your fascination, especially with Game of Thrones, which you worked on a lot?
Well, of course, in season 1 of Game of Thrones, there isn't really any material that's filmed in Iceland, but it was the opening that really caught my imagination. It was the mysterious events going on before the credits, when you have a group of knights riding out of Castle Black, then you have some mysterious unseen enemy in the snow, and then you have bodies arranged in a strange ritual pattern. Then you have the title sequence, which begins to map out the world. And then the opening episode gives you very quickly life in Winterfell, a sense of what it's like in the north. You have the delineation of King's Landing, which is very much kind of late medieval court. And then you have the scenes at Daenerys and Khal Drogo's wedding over in Pentos. So you have 3 very different locations, but really good storytelling in terms of setting up the different parts of this particular world.
And it's a particular world, as you just said. So is that a difference between Game of Thrones and other epic fantasies, or maybe as well in historical fiction, where also some kind of world is laid out, but to me it seems that there are really striking differences in the way what is laid out as a world, and also in the way where it is or what is imagined to be.
What's interesting in Game of Thrones, I think, is that it ranges not only across a great deal of space, both in Westeros and Essos, but also in time as well. And people have pointed out that what you have beyond the wall is a group of prehistoric tribes, and in parts of the north as well. In the Neck, for example, you have people living very much in the way that native Britons would have been living when the Romans came. But then in the north itself, at Winterfell, you have a kind of pre-Norman conquest, early medieval social setup, whereas you have a bunch of Vikings in the form of the Ironborn. You have in King's Landing a late medieval English court. In Dawn, you have a kind of Moorish Spain. And then you have emerging Mediterranean, maybe even early modern cities across the Channel. And then, or across the Narrow Sea, I should say. And then further away, you have more and more varied cultures. The Dothraki, for example, very much look like the Mongols who ruled from China all the way across to the gates of what's now Budapest in their time. It's the greatest land empire the world has ever seen. So you have a great sweep of geographical space in this world, but also this sense of different time periods being melded together in a way that makes the scale of Game of Thrones different, say, from the world of Lord of the Rings, where you have a basically medievalized setting with quite a lot of geographical difference, but the social structures are not as varied as they are in Game of Thrones.
But an interesting thing might be that we also, not only we as professionals or scholars, but that Game of Thrones in a whole is received as to be some kind of medieval, so that there are different aspects but which are not differentiated for the recipients, and they tend to not do it themselves, I would think. But these are things we as scholars would try to precise, to differentiate, to put, to attach to special times and locations in between this range of 500 to 1500 BC to what we know is the Middle Ages. But we would try to differentiate that. But fantasy obviously doesn't have to, or wouldn't like to.
Yeah, and I think for a popular audience, they can see there's a difference between the culture of the North. It's one of the kind of talking points of the show, in the sense that the North has a kind of independence, which is achieved by the end of the show when Sansa becomes the queen in the North. And I think it's right that audiences are going to apprehend all of this as medieval, and they're not necessarily going to think that places like Braavos and Pentos on the other side of the narrow sea are no longer medieval, that they're already coming into the modern because they have banking, they have cash economies and so on. People won't make that kind of differentiation, I don't think. But it's part of Martin's world-building approach, because he's so steeped in history and because he's so interested in how different institutions work, that he takes the time to build a world which has a working model of a bank, which thinks about how trade is financed between the different kingdoms, that thinks about the problems of distance as well, how long it takes to get from King's Landing to Winterfell, and makes that classic fantasy move, which is always very important, of finding a way to get news from one part of this world to another that's not going to take somebody on a horse 6 months to deliver, so that you have the system of ravens. And that's absolutely crucial to the plot, to have a non-medieval communication system.
And the scope in historical fiction, in contrast to that, seems a bit smaller. When I remember Ken Follett, for example, his novels about Kingsbridge, you also have moving around between different cities, the fictitious city Kingsbridge and the nearby real cities, but it seems that the scope of the action is smaller. Of course, a world is imagined, but it is a world that we imagine as to be our own Middle Ages, so our own England in a time about the 1220s or whatever. So something that we can imagine as a past of our own, whereas Game of Thrones has this really big scope and a history of its own.
Yes, it's somebody's past, even if it's not our past necessarily. If we're thinking about conditions in Dawn, which is always different, as people keep saying in the show, or conditions in the Free Cities as well. It's not our past, it's not our medieval past, but nevertheless, the fantasy element in the generic construction of this world means that you can improve on this world. You can simplify things by having ravens as a communication system. You can have various kinds of weapon that can be used, which I think if you have guns, you're already getting into the modern, and people are going to say, whoa, that's not medieval anymore. But you can have various other kinds of weapons in medieval fantasy that weren't necessarily known in the culture on which that particular invented world is based, but nevertheless help to speed the story along a bit. So yeah, I think there's interesting adjustments going on in building these medieval worlds, not only in which bits of the medieval world you're going to choose to put in, but how you're going to adapt what you choose to the taste of a fantasy audience and the taste of a modern audience. How much you're going to be able to take for granted. So you don't need anybody to sit down and explain what a knight is or what a tournament is or how a castle, what the advantage of a castle is. The audience brings that knowledge already to that world, and that kind of world building then becomes less onerous. If you think about what it would be like to build a world from scratch with nothing at all, you end up with a kind of sci-fi. But even in sci-fi, when you're explaining what kind of planet this is that you've set your story in and what kind of atmosphere they have and whether you can go outside or not and what the air pressure is like, is there water, all these kinds of things. Nevertheless, sci-fi already has these conventions that we make assumptions about that kind of world building. So what's interesting about medieval fantasy in particular, I think, is the way that we know enough about it that you don't have to have a huge amount of exposition. But at the same time, we don't know so much that we say, that's inauthentic. Those are the wrong kinds of sword decorations here. At that period, they wouldn't have that kind of hilt on the sword because there is no that period, because of the way in which different parts of the Middle Ages have melted together in the imagination of the world's creator.
And maybe this way to look for what is right and what is wrong is an approach which former research sometimes had, I think. But and nowadays our approach here in the project and within our cooperation has been a whole lot different, and we try to get to know what are the mechanisms that build the world, what can be taken for granted, what can't, what are ways to improve, as you just said. So is the being pre-modern, would you say this is some kind of basic rule for the fantasy world? So you mentioned the example of guns, so there can be guns, there is no railway or something like that, so everything needs to be pre-industrialization, and within that you have this melting process of different times, location, fantasy aspects as well.
Yeah, I think pre-industrial is probably the key thing, and that once you start having evidence of industrialization, then you're into the world of steampunk, I think. And that means that you have a kind of, in some ways, idealized past in which there's no heavy industry, in which simple craftsmen are happily forging swords or making pots or digging in the fields. And it's a kind of what in Britain we would call a kind of merry England, a highly, in some ways, romanticized depiction of the Middle Ages. But at the same time, that's a very 19th century idealized version. And already in the 19th century, you were getting a darker version of that kind of medieval. You were getting a more Gothic version. And people like Helen Young have identified a much grittier medievalism since then from the 20th century, where the mud is emphasized. It's always raining, the clothes are dark, life is really hard and cruel and short. And the idealization has vanished into a kind of dystopian Middle Ages, which looks very different in some ways. But I think at the same time, the fact we don't know a lot about the Middle Ages, but we know enough, is kind of crucial. And it's why the medieval has become almost a necessary part of fantasy fiction. At the same time, we do have some writers, and I'm thinking here of Susanna Clarke in Britain, who wrote a huge novel, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which is set in a kind of alternative Napoleonic Wars, or in fact it's that 18th century world, 18th, early 19th century world, but magic has come back into it, so it's an intrusion fantasy in that way. Magic, which was dead, comes back to life again. And it's interesting when you see, as you do in Game of Thrones, that trope of the intrusion fantasy where magic was thought to have vanished, suddenly coming back and providing the fantasy in the medieval fantasy of the show.
I would like to come back a moment to the knowledge we just talked about. I think or would you think that there could be differentiated two forms of knowledge? So one that is some kind of scholarly knowledge to know what elements from where go into this world are melted in a specific way, and maybe the other one, some kind of popular knowledge. So what is taken for granted in the Middle Ages, but what is special about the worlds of Westeros or Oxenford with Sapkowski, or maybe also Tolkien's Middle-earth. So do these contexts, these new worlds that were built, do they form a particular knowledge that could be called popular knowledge?
Yeah, I think we can say that the popular knowledge accepts a kind of mixture of styles and a mixture of, for example, the armour that knights wear. I don't know much about medieval armour, and I'm perfectly happy to accept that people are wearing armour and they have weak points which their enemies are going to take advantage of. And in fact, in my reading of The Witcher, I've realised that people are going around with bits of armour. I have no idea what they are. And I came across a weapon yesterday. I have no idea. It seems to be some kind of lance. But I don't really know what it does. I don't really care either. And that's kind of the important point, I think, for large sectors of the fantasy audience don't really care about this kind of thing. But at the same time, there are smaller sectors of a fantasy audience who care quite a lot. And for example, when you have the staging of battles in fantasy, there's always a section in the fandom that says that's a completely ridiculous way to have a battle. Nobody would be fighting like that. You need to bring in one wing and then you have to have the other wing. You have to have a coverage. You need a kind of shield wall. You would then have call back those men and send some other men across. And indeed, it's a kind of meme, I think, that medieval battles in fantasy are just a bunch of people running at each other, shouting a lot and waving their weapons about, without even necessarily having the cavalry in front, let alone a shield wall. And so you can see how if you have detailed knowledge, and it doesn't have to be academic knowledge, it doesn't have to be the kind of knowledge that says that sword hilt is the wrong type, but simply that is not how people would have fought, or that kind of musical instrument is unknown in the medieval world, and they would have been playing something else entirely. So the generic convention is people go around with lutes all the time, because lutes are everybody knows a lute is a medieval instrument, and then poor people can have a whistle of some sort or a flute. And you don't have to then worry too much about what stringed instruments might have become available then. So yeah, I think there are different kinds of knowledge that people are bringing to their watching. And some of it is simply a kind of familiarity with the genre, that they know the genre conventions and they're expecting to see certain things like a tournament, like a minstrel, like a beautiful lady, people riding around on horses, and so on. But then there are others who are going to be watching more critically, but not with the kind of what we might call nitpicking criticism of the academic.
Yeah, we just mentioned, or you just mentioned, the fandoms, and they're only a small but an important part of the paratexts that emerged around, let's say, Game of Thrones here. So we have this gigantic amount of readers who talk about or write about what they liked, what they disliked. We have newspapers doing comments on new novels or new seasons which have aired. And maybe also they report about the economic success Martin or HBO as a production company have had with new seasons or the whole series as well. But what was striking to me when I once realized it is that Martin himself seems really talkative about his own work. So he seems to be really eager to talk about what he was thinking writing A Song of Ice and Fire. And I found one interview in which he is talking about sexual violence and the portrayal of rape. And he tries to defend that depiction with some claim of authenticity. And I brought a little quote which I might read out for us. And I'm interested what you think, what does that do? He says, in order to defend the portrayal of rape, he said, I quote, "I wanted my books to be strongly grounded in history and show what medieval society was like. And I was also reacting to a lot of fantasy fiction. Most stories depict what I call the Disneyland Middle Ages. There are princes and princesses and knights in shining armor. If you're going to write about war and just include all the cool battles, and you don't portray sexual violence, then there's something fundamentally dishonest about that." What do you think? What do such claims as these change in our way in which we're receiving Game of Thrones as authentical and maybe also authentically medieval?
Well, I think Game of Thrones in some ways, and both the books, which after all have a very similar narrative to what we find in the show, but the show more especially because the visualization, the representation on screen of things like torture, sexual violence and so on has recalibrated in some ways people's understanding of the medieval past as having been, yeah, sure, violent. But if we think about more airbrushed Hollywood productions, when you think of historical films in which you have armies fighting, again, you might see one or two people being trampled by a horse or somebody having their head cut off. But in the past, it's all been quite tasteful. And I think now, and this has partly to do with the kind of audience that that HBO has been encouraging, what people want to see is that gritty medievalism, but it's also a grittiness which incorporates violence and sexual violence as well. This is partly a kind of marketing ploy for HBO, that they want to show things that you can't see on US TV. And this brings in a certain kind of audience. But it's established sexual violence as a kind of hallmark of the medieval period, which in some ways it probably was. And I think Martin's point, which is sometimes misunderstood, is that what you don't see when you see historical epics on film is women getting raped in the villages by the men as the knights ride on and go off and do something in the castle. But that would have happened. But what wouldn't have happened to the extent that we have in Game of Thrones is sexual violence directed towards aristocratic women. And that clearly is something which is there for its shock value, there for its narrative value, but is in some ways rather dishonest, I think. And it's coloured the way in which people read these kinds of shows now, such that in the reception of House of the Dragon, for example, though as far as I can remember, there were women who were having sex somewhat unwillingly with elderly husbands, but there wasn't any rape. But yet people are commenting on House of the Dragon are still talking about the sexual violence in it, because they expected it to be there. Even if you ask them, well, where was it? They would say, oh, yeah, well, it was everywhere, wasn't it? And so it has reconfigured in an interesting way, I think, our expectations, even as I would argue Game of Thrones itself started dialing down the sexual violence in the last seasons because of the kind of pushback it was getting from parts of its fan base that it wanted to keep.
Yeah, and when you remember the sexual violence that Ramsay Bolton, for example, inflicts on Sansa Stark, it was really horrifying, I think, and so declining from that seems to be a good idea. But it also does something to direct the sympathies within the seasons and the episodes, because when finally Ramsay Bolton died, I was really, really glad that he's off screen now.
Yeah, he was so, he was so predictably horrible. He had so few scenes where he actually appeared human, one of which, of course, was with his father, when his father legitimizes him, and you think perhaps this will be a kind of healing moment. But it's, even in that depiction, and there's a lot of discussion about Sansa's wedding night, what was happening was mostly off screen, and what we were watching was Theon watching what was happening. And so we could see from the very fine acting that Theon was doing that something absolutely traumatizing was going on. But nevertheless, you didn't see anything as explicit as the sex between Jaime and Cersei in Baelor Sept, for example. And that was a scene which went too far in the direction of sexual violence. And then the showrunners had to get the actors and the director to say, no, that wasn't a rape at all. It was just cut in a way that perhaps wasn't really as skillful in giving the right impression. I think, in fact, the director knew exactly what he was doing. But when there was such furore, he was put out to say, oh, no, you're all mistaking what happened. And he didn't get asked back in the following seasons. I think that tells us something.
And we see that there are a lot of things beyond the medieval or combined with the medieval that shape the way we think about such worlds as Game of Thrones, and that shape our expectations and also shape the way the series is made itself. And this leads me to another point that made us some of this change, and this is the thing we're concerned here so much with, and it's the popularity. The popularity that is recognized, so being the recognition that something is being noticed by many, and that the spectacular staging of this popularity through saying how much views or downloads one season or one episode gets, how much money was made with the show. So all these things would be staging of popularity, and this maybe has two functions, so that's our key thesis here. On the one hand, of course, it seems to is used to attract more popularity, so more being noticed. But it seems to me that the knowing that something is popular also changes, on the one hand, the way in which we receive things, popular things, and that it shapes also and differs in the way that these things are being produced and are being held up, or they are built prequels and sequels, and this all has to do with the knowing that something is popular and is probably popular in the future as well.
Yeah, and this is, I think we can in some ways describe this sort of kind of capitalist impulse, that if something has proved to be very popular, and Game of Thrones was not only hugely popular, but in some ways surprisingly hugely popular, that the original pilot was scrapped and nobody can ever see it now because it was so bad, apparently. And there was very much kind of gamble of would the show take off? And then it did become popular and became more and more popular. And so the search for the next Game of Thrones has been going on ever since probably about season 3, probably about 2014. And you can see how there's a kind of tension between finding a new thing that hasn't been done before, but which is the same kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So making the TV show The Witcher, for example, and doing more of the same. And the great fan demand is for more adventures with the characters that they already know. So people want Jon Snow back, or some people want to hear what Jon Snow's doing behind the wall. But there was a real kind of flurry of fan interest when Maisie Williamson let it be known that she would be open to having Arya come back and join up with Jon and do things, adventure beyond the wall together. And the showrunners haven't picked that up yet, but it's something that they might be thinking about. So it's partly, can you use the same characters, the ones who are still alive, of course, or do you go in for prequels? Do you go in for sequels? Now, sequels, obviously, is demands new narratives about your characters. With Martin's world, because he's written Fire and Blood, because you have a somewhat Tolkien-like building of the past world, that there is a kind of legendarium that you can draw upon. But what it doesn't have, and what I think has been a drawback for Game of Thrones in the latter seasons, and could be for some of the other prequels, is not enough narrative, that Martin himself isn't producing enough narrative to fuel what the fan demand might be. And it's interesting to see the prequels that have been floated and then been dropped are ones where there's almost nothing to go on in terms of Martin's own narrative production.
Yeah, you could see that with House of the Dragon, which is really concentrating on the question of succession, rightful, unrightful succession. And it would interest me what you would say. Has the prequel become more medieval in terms compared with Game of Thrones?
Yeah, I think it probably has, but that's because it's centred in King's Landing, which is, in a sense, more archetypally medieval, high medieval, than anywhere else. And what is striking is that although King's Landing was much better lit 200 years later in Game of Thrones, it seems to be very dark in House of the Dragon. Its contours are still the same, and the fashions seem to be still the same. The culture seems to be broadly similar, though we haven't seen any tournaments yet. Because that world has become more restricted in House of the Dragon, it's even more medieval than the pre-medieval or the verging on early modern that we saw in the Game of Thrones universe.
Yeah, let's leave the Game of Thrones universe. Good point. Because we already talked a lot about it, but you're an expert in fantasy fiction well beyond that, and that is why I have to ask you something about the success that the Vikings have had for several years now. Recently, a new film by Robert Eggers was released called The Northman, and we maybe also all know or have heard of the series The Vikings, which is concerned with the fate of Ragnar Lodbrok. Very early after airing, a friend recommended The Vikings to me, and he told me about what was going on, what were some of the key narratives, and to be honest, I was a bit deterred by all this raiding, burning, and swinging axes. But when I finally digged into it, the one thing or the two things that interested me most were on the one hand, the depiction of this Viking society, so the way social structures are functioning and the way conflicts are laid out or solved at least. And the one thing, and the other thing was the cultural contact that the Vikings made throughout their journey to England and later to Europe as well. These were interesting things, but what interested me most and what caught my fascination was the fascination other people had for the Vikings, and I haven't found a proper answer to that. So as I now have the chance to ask you, you have to tell me what is such why are the Vikings, not only the series but the people we nowadays call the Vikings or we think of as Vikings, what is such fascinating about them? Why are they so successful in fantasy and in popular fiction?
I think you're right to say there are two phenomena here. One is the success of the Vikings, and one is the success of Vikings as a period in medieval culture that people are deeply interested in. And I think here one of the key answers is that driving interest in Vikings is the fact that the Vikings settled so widely across the North Atlantic, including large swathes of the British Isles, and that they got to North America. Now the North American angle on the Viking presence, or the medieval Scandinavian presence in America, has become more right-wing, more supremacists, more nationalists in a kind of unhealthy and unhistorical sense. But in Britain and of course in Scandinavia, these people are our ancestors, and therefore we are interested in those stories. It's also the case, of course, that the Viking world was a huge one, that you could go from as far west as Lancy Meadows, the settlement that we have in Newfoundland in Canada, to Greenland. You can go to Ireland, to Dublin is a Viking settlement. Then you have Vikings sailing through the Pillars of Hercules into the Mediterranean, down the Russian rivers, coming to Constantinople, as well as sacking Paris, as well as trading in the Gulf of Bothnia and so on. So you have a huge geographical sweep. And that, I think, is one of the things that makes the TV show really interesting, that it covers an important period of Viking expansion and raiding and increasingly settlement in various places. But it also allows for this changes of locations, which in some ways is like Game of Thrones, that the world of, to take another show set in the same era, The Last Kingdom, is very much what's happening in Britain. And you go from the north to the south, you go from the pagans to the Christians, you may go to Ireland, I think, at one point, but it's a much more concentrated and much more historically engaged kind of picture that you have in The Last Kingdom. But Vikings gives that same kind of epic sweep that we have in Game of Thrones. And I think what's also happened with Vikings and The Vikings is that the Academy has become increasingly involved in feeding knowledge into the making of these shows. One friend of mine has been a historical consultant on Vikings, and people tend to know, people who are fans of The Vikings, tend to know the name of Michael Hurst, who's the guy who's the main historical consultant. I don't think you've had that on these kinds of shows before, that you have a person you can point to and refer to and go, he's the one who brings this expert knowledge to bear. And it's not that he's an academic himself, but he knows where to find from archaeologists, to find from literary specialists, from historians, the kind of knowledge that he needs to build that world to make it look convincing. And this is something which I think we can see also with Eggers's film, that one of the kind of marketing strategies that used was not Eggers' own claim, but a claim made by the New Yorker. This may be the most accurate Viking movie ever made. And it was accurate, given certain values for the meaning of accuracy, because Eggers got the Academy involved so much. He got a leading archaeologist, he got a folklore specialist, he got an expert on the lives of women to feed into the script, to tell him what would work and what wouldn't work, and got them continually involved when the film was finally released. So they were doing social media outreach, they were doing a certain amount of interviews, both more specialist interviews, but Neil Price, the archaeologist, was talking to Time magazine about the film. And so there is this kind of hunger for authenticity that Game of Thrones kind of tapped into, I think, which Vikings was able to foreground much more because it was more historically grounded. It didn't claim to be part of the kind of fantasy genre. Northman is kind of hovering uneasily between something that claims to be historical, but something which incorporates fantasy elements while refusing to call them fantasy and saying this is just part of the Viking mindset. But nevertheless, this appeal to actual history is practiced by actual historians and archaeology is practiced by actual archaeologists, and new finds which are feeding back into the imagination of that world is kind of critical, I think, for maybe where the fantasy genre is going.
Yeah. That's interesting. So we can see some kind of shift between the demarcation line between scholarly and popular knowledge, so that there has happened something after Game of Thrones and after all these claims for authenticity and accuracy, so that now the scholarly knowledge and the academia gets involved, and not just behind the scenes, but is used in a marketing way of speaking to make these series, these films popular by telling the people who watch and who listen that this is, from an academic point of view, accurate under certain circumstances.
Yeah, and I think it's increasingly become part of the academy, if you like, to go beyond the idea that Tolkien, Game of Thrones, The Witcher, The Vikings are a kind of gateway drug, that if you encourage people to consume these things, you can then come to them and say, you enjoyed Game of Thrones very much. Wouldn't you like to study the Nibelungenlied, or wouldn't you like to take a look at Beowulf, or learn more about the culture of the Ironborn, but the real Ironborn, who are the Vikings? And I think that used to be the way in which Tolkien certainly was used to kind of entice people into medieval studies. But now I think the interaction between the discipline of medieval studies and the discipline, if you like, of media studies, of analysing what's going on in popular culture, has become much more closely linked, partly because we're encouraged to go out there, particularly in the UK, to go out there and do outreach, and to do all these media interviews saying this is correct and this is not correct, to become part of this kind of capitalist machinery that's producing narratives that people want to consume themselves, that we've become implicated in that. In a way which I think we sometimes ought to stop and question a little bit, at the same time as it really does validate what we're doing beyond the academy, and it's important to get some buy-in from the rest of the nation as to what's going on in the ivory towers.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So because the popular culture or culture seems to have, in its longing for popularity and in its noticing of the things that are popular, has obviously pressure to the academia and pressures them to get involved, and the academia has to justify itself why one should or shouldn't involve, why should you be resistant maybe, or why should you assimilate to that demand of popular fiction or popular culture in a whole.
Yeah, and in a way you've got to tailor the arguments that you're making to your audience. So on the one hand, you might be saying to students, come and study with us and you'll see what the real inspiration for Game of Thrones is, but actually you'll be studying medieval history and medieval literature and culture. And if you have knowledgeable teachers, they'll draw comparisons across and go, look, this dragon in Beowulf is very much the dragon of Game of Thrones. This one, on the other hand, that we find in Old Norse can actually talk. So that's rather different. Yeah, what's the difference between a talking dragon and a non-talking dragon? So it's very much a question of subjects, I think, within the academy which come under pressure. For example, why are medieval studies relevant? Wouldn't we be better to cut the number of people studying them and have everybody doing post-colonial literature instead? If we can show that the medieval is a vital part of contemporary culture, then we can save that space in the academy. But at the same time, we also have voices in the academy who are saying, but popular culture isn't really high culture. It's not really worth all this effort that you're expending on analysing it. It's escapist nonsense. It's not historical. It's not doing anything important. And the kinds of claims that people sometimes make, that if Shakespeare was still alive, or if Shakespeare were alive now, he would be writing for Hollywood and he would probably be writing superhero movies. I don't believe that for a moment. But nevertheless, Shakespeare knew what the popular was, and he knew where he wanted to incorporate it in his writing. So I haven't got much time for this kind of elitist dismissal of popular culture as something that we shouldn't bother with because we should be reading Shakespeare or Milton.
I want to use the opportunity and talk about your new book. I brought it with me, The Norse Myths and the way that shape the way we think. In this book, you really convincingly argue that the reception of Norse myths doesn't start just in the 20th or 21st century, but that it starts right after the myths are written down, or at least when they arouse interest again in around the 18th century, and that there is no such thing as a rediscovery of Norse myths, but that they instead have a really stable way in which they are recepted. But what is with the Vikings or the Norse myths around them, what is special about the way they are used in the 21st century? So what is new or what is still old about the Norse myths that are used in popular culture?
Well, I think what's happened, we can maybe point to two different phenomena here. One is that the Norse myths were part of high culture, if we think back to Wagner in the 19th century. And people were always interested in retelling the myths, primarily for children in the 19th and early 20th century. And then Tolkien took up a part of them, at least, in his in The Hobbit, and then going forwards into The Lord of the Rings. But at the same time as Tolkien, somewhere between high culture and popular culture, but increasingly become part of the canon, at least. We also had the Marvel comic universe, and first of all you had the comic strip, The Mighty Thor, starting in the 1960s, which was popular in itself, but it had a kind of limited popularity. But once the Marvel comic universe decided to start making movies about Thor, that was, I think, the moment at which Thor himself became a global figure. And one whose story people recognised as the young man, or the young god, if you like, who's trying to carve out his identity, he's trying to work out his future, his responsibility towards humans and his affection for them, the politics of Asgard, the family relationships between his father, who wants to give up the kingship of Asgard to him, his problematic relations with his adoptive brother Loki. Now, Loki isn't Thor's brother at all in the myths, but that doesn't really matter. And so Odin and Thor and Loki have become figures that people know an awful lot about. And that's really contributed hugely, I think, to general knowledge about those three gods in particular. Odin as kind of superannuated, he wants to give up the throne. Very often in other versions of the myths, he's looking for a retirement home, or he wants to die, he just needs to get out of the picture. And it's very much a sense of a patriarchy that's worn out. And Thor as a younger generation who's also trying to renegotiate the paradigm of masculinity, that it does involve whacking people with your hammer a lot, but it also involves too getting on with women, protecting people, thinking, acting in the interests of large communities and so on, and taking over really important roles. And Loki is this incredibly flexible figure of various kinds of using various kinds of stratagems, a figure who is queer in kind of unquantifiable ways, who is funny as well, and who is cunning, and who has the wisecracks. So we can see how those figures really have caught a global popular imagination, at the same time as the same figures have turned up in novels, in new operas, in other kinds of retelling, sometimes for children, sometimes for adults. But it's usually those figures who have been of most interest. What's been missing, and it's because of the paucity of myths about the goddesses, is very strong female figures. What we do have is the Valkyries, who appear obviously in Wagner, where Brunhilde turns up to turns out to be the heroine of the whole cycle, if you like. And so it's the Valkyries who, we have a character called Valkyrie in the Marvel comic universe. It's the Valkyries who've captured, along with the idea of the fighting woman, the shield maiden, who've really captured the popular imagination, and figures of fighting women then turn up in the Last Kingdom and turn up in the Vikings as well. So they've been really crucial in rethinking the possibilities of the past, based in part on new discoveries in archaeology. But we should also, I think, talk about Ragnarök as a word that people know what the concept is, even if they don't know what the word itself actually means. And I think the idea that the end of the world is coming, and everybody knows that, and the gods have to find a way of facing it with courage and fortitude to go down fighting and not to just kind of roll over and die, is something that increasingly we're looking around at the planet burning and asking ourselves whether Ragnarök is here, and is it just as inescapable for us as it was for the gods? And I think that's a myth that is really pertinent to thinking about where we are today.
Yeah, you mentioned Ragnarök and as well some keywords as queerness, masculinity, and so on. And one other argument in your book is that these interests in Norse myths doesn't only speak to our interest in the past, but that it addresses our contemporary hopes, fears, concepts we're dealing with, discourses we have. So these three you just named, are these one of these concepts or fears that are addressed throughout reception of Norse mythology?
Yeah, I think you can look at the geography of Norse myth. You can look at the idea of the world tree and the kind of holistic idea of a tree which nourishes and supports everything in the universe. You can see a kind of organic, green, environmental vision there. And you can see also changing roles for women. This is a longer term project than just in the 21st century, of course, but the possibility that women can do anything that men can do. You have this idea of the generational shift of how you get, in British terms, you get the baby boomers to move aside, and you get the millennials and Generation X and Generation Z to find their own place in the world, which is maybe what Thor is trying to do. You have a kind of postmodern sensibility of saying what you need to say in order to get something done, which may have no necessary relationship with the truth, which is Loki's strategy, which is a kind of Trumpian approach to the world as well, I think. And alongside that, we have the possibility of thinking about what fame means. We have the idea of Valhalla. We have an actual Valhalla here in Germany on the banks of the Danube near Regensburg. What does it mean to be famous? What even is a Hall of Fame? We have the Hollywood Hall of Fame. We have the Baseball Hall of Fame. And that idea of the hall where people are commemorated, where their fame lives on even though they're dead, is something that's taken from Norse myth as well. And how you become famous, what kind of hero you have to be, what kind of person you have to be to achieve fame is also a really live question too. So I think the Norse myths speak in all kinds of ways to popular preoccupations. They always have, in a sense, ever since they escaped from Iceland and got into Europe. And they're always speaking to a contemporary readership to help them unpack the things they're interested in at the time. But at the moment, I think because contemporary Western culture, but as we also know, Eastern culture is interested in Norse myths as well. The popular topic in anime and manga, for example. The range of things you can think about with the Norse myths is what really ensures their enduring popularity.
So the Norse myths and also the fantasy fiction maybe in a whole and the things we today talked about are wonderful examples of why fantasy or fiction is not just escapism, but in which ways it speaks to our contemporary discourses, arguments, ideas, ideals, and so on. So that it's not just living in the past, dealing with what kind of shield or what kind of lance one may have in which world, but that it is dealing with central things in our Western and worldwide cultures.
Yeah, just not just what was it like, but what could it be like?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Perfect. We talked about a lot of things, and we could keep going, I think, for several hours. But I have one last question I want to ask you, and that is, what are your new plans? What are inspirations or things you take home, talk about, think about after being here? But also, what are your plans for the future? What is to be investigated in fantasy fiction?
Well, I certainly want to do more with Viking medievalism, and I plan to write further on the film The Northman by Robert Eggers, which is a really interesting phenomenon, I think. So I'm certainly going to do further work on that. I'm also thinking about how sequels and prequels happen, how these epic universes that are created generate more story, but what happens when the original writer of the story is dead, as in the case of Tolkien, or is engaged in other projects like George R.R. Martin. How do you take that world and expand it in a way which does justice to it without alienating your fan base? And that takes us back to some very interesting questions, once again, very fundamental questions to literary study, of where narrative and history meet one another. What kinds of stories can be told? How do they reach out to the contemporary to capture people's imaginations at the same time as they fulfill the generic conventions that you need to be able to understand them, and to produce a plot line which people will become completely absorbed in the way that they did with Game of Thrones.
Yeah, that sounds very interesting, and I'm really looking forward to it, and hope we can follow up on this discussion and others we had in the weeks you were here in Siegen. Thank you very much for your answers. I gave the questions, you gave the answers today. Yeah. And thank you for being here in Siegen. It has been such a wonderful time with such interesting discussions. Thank you very much.
Well, I've learned such a lot from being here, and I go home with renewed enthusiasm for research into the medieval fantastic world.
Found wonderful. Thank you all for watching, and see you on another occasion. Bye.
Right. Goodbye.
Bye.